Resiliency Within, with host Elaine Miller-Karas, is brought to you by Trauma Resource Institute, Incorporated. Visit traumaresourceinstitute.com.
Welcome to Resiliency Within, featuring your host, Elaine Miller-Karas. In unprecedented times, our beliefs and well-being are put to the test. When we take the things we've learned in life and look at challenges in a whole new way, we learn to develop resiliency, which can then be used to promote healing and personal strength. Now, here is Elaine Miller-Karas.
Welcome to Resiliency Within. I'm your host, Elaine Miller-Karas, and today's show is entitled Healing Embodied Trauma, the Trauma Resiliency Model. It is in honor of Mother's Day and Mental Health Awareness Month. My daughter, Jesessica Karas Waterson, who's also a psychotherapist, is my guest today. I am overjoyed. I am overjoyed that she's here with me, and I was so excited when she decided to become a psychotherapist. And we have now the shared interest of helping people with trauma, and we now work together. So we'll be sharing with you the Trauma Resiliency Model, a therapeutic intervention to heal and repair the wake of traumatic experiences that can be used with children, with teens and adults. I've been one of the key developers in the model. And what's going to happen today is we really wanted to highlight the model because of Mental Health Awareness Month. And I'm really dedicated to bring body-centered models to the masses. And this really was inspired by me and others when I realized that there were a lot of body-centered therapeutics that people were offering around the world, but they were very expensive. So we wanted to bring something forward that was maybe didn't take so long to take the training, and we still could develop proficiency. So then when Jesessica and I were talking about it, we said, well, Jesessica, you can come on. You're a Trauma Resiliency Model certified practitioner, and you can interview me. So I wanted to say a little bit about this too, because about talk therapy versus body-centered therapy. You sometimes may hear the term, it's a top-down approach or a bottom-up. So when we talk about top-down, we're talking about cognitive thinking models. So if something difficult has happened to you, you may be asked by a therapist to tell them your perceptions about maybe how you view yourself, and maybe you'll have perceptions that are distorted. So they may use thinking models to have you shift a perspective about what you think about yourself. That's a talk therapy, talking about your experience. But bottom up works with your biological reactions to the events and experiences of your life. And that's what Jessie and I are going to talk to you more about today. But I want to tell you a little bit more about her. Well, she specializes in the treatment of PTSD, anxiety, depression. She's been involved with the Trauma Resource Institute since 2007, when she accompanied me to Nairobi, Kenya, where I was speaking at a conference to end female genital mutilation. I think at that time, she was on the verge of maybe becoming a nurse. She didn't know, but I think maybe she'll share a little bit of with us why that experience shifted her direction. But she is a certified CRIM teacher and a trainer and a consultant for CRIM and the Trauma Resiliency Model. And during the show, we're going to call TRIM the Trauma Resiliency Model, because otherwise we're saying that big long word the whole time. So TRIM is what we'll be referring to. She currently has a telehealth practice, so she's seeing people virtually like many therapists are around the country. And she is a somatic therapist, meaning she integrates the mind, the body, and the spirit into her work. She has trained and facilitated in different settings around the US. She's done some things with me. We've always had such a wonderful time together, bringing this work forward, and also trying to do some fun things while we're visiting a new city. But she's also had a really rich background. She worked in an inpatient forensic outpatient chronic pain unit as well. And she was actually highlighted in the A&E's intervention show. And she was on that show a couple times when she was working with addiction and dependency. She has one of the dreams of my life, my 4.5-year-old granddaughter, Madison, that she says she hopes to help and guide her towards her passion in life as well. So Jesessica, welcome. And as we begin, can you share with us just what's on your mind today as we start? That's the question I always start with my guests.
What's on my mind right now? Just that I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to share TRIM with the world and what inspired you to create TRIM, and just how the Trauma Resource Institute has been so wonderful at just, I think, community and also spreading healing throughout the world. So I really can't wait to talk more about that as well.
Thank you, Jess. And we were talking a little bit about this as we were getting started. And I have two children. I have a son who was born in 1979, and my daughter was born in 1983. I often think, oh my goodness, how can I have children that are in their late 30s and early 40s when I'm only 40 myself? Of course, that's not true. But I think one of the joys for me of being a parent is seeing how they grow and what they decide to be in this life. And as we know, and we're talking about Mother's Day, that not all of us had mothers that were nurturing. And not all of us were lucky enough to have experiences where we had unconditional positive regard. And I certainly have tried. We have her on the show. She can tell me whether I did it or not. But to give my children space to be able to create the lives that they wanted to create. And so that's what I certainly hope for my granddaughter. And what we're going to do about Mother's Day, the second part of the show, at the end, we'll talk a little bit about what our experiences have been as well, being during the pandemic. And Jessica and her family moved into our home, and we pretty much merged two families because of the intensity and needing help. So we'll talk a little bit about that, as many places in the country are opening up, and we know that there's places in the world that are suffering greatly, like India and other parts of the world that may not have access to the vaccine yet. So we also want to appreciate and understand that is a continued trauma that many people are experiencing. So we're going to segue now into getting started. And Jessica is going to start by she's going to be interviewing me. So Jessica, what's your first question for me?
Well, I have many questions for you today, and I'm sure the world would also like to hear what you have to say. So
Okay,
the
we'll
first one
see.
so let's start with the first one. What inspired you to create TRIM?
Well, in 1994, I believe it was, I started working at what is now Arrowhead Medical Regional Center in San Bernardino County. And I was working as a teacher of family medicine. And I've mentioned this in the show before, that many people would come into the clinic and they would be complaining about headaches, stomach aches, all sorts of different complaints. And the doctors would do a thorough evaluation, but many times they couldn't find the reason. And often the reason why was often because their lives were just riddled with traumatic experiences, not only what was happening now, but what may have happened in their past, from the cumulative experiences of trauma. So I began at that time to have a wonderful chairman of our department, Dr. Emily Ebert, and she gave the social workers, I was the behavioral science faculty, funds to take continuing education credits. So I took everything I could to bring in more information that I could bring and impart to the residents about trauma, and also the physical aspects of trauma and how that was impacting their patients. So as I began doing this, it turned out on light bulbs for me. And I went to as many things as I could. I heard Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine, Pat Ogden, Babette Rothschild, people at that time that were the leaders in the field. And I saw that the body-centered therapies were so important. And yet I was working in San Bernardino County. I knew lots of social workers that worked in the county. And social workers that work in county systems sometimes do not make as much money as private practice therapists. But I noticed that many of the people that were taking some of the courses I was taking were all working with middle and upper middle class folks. Of course, they need therapy too, but that these kinds of therapies were almost prohibitive for some, let's say, psychotherapists that working with people that were on the margins of society, and they were expensive. So I was thinking, how could a body-centered approach be brought to therapists that wouldn't be so pricey, so it would make them more accessible? And also I had a lot of other ideas of what I wanted to integrate into a model of intervention. And I met a wonderful woman named Jeannie Everett. And Jeannie was a nurse and also a somatic psychotherapist. And she and I had many experiences together. We traveled to Thailand together. And she and I had this first idea, wouldn't it be interesting if we could do a short-term model that wouldn't take so long? And she was really interested in bringing this to nurses. And we had many common interests because we both had worked in medical care. And we also had a biological basis of our background because we worked with doctors and nurses. So in any event, we got really fired up. And so she and I collaborated in the beginning, and we created the first derivation of the trauma resiliency model was called trauma first aid. And, we worked together in the beginning, and then she decided to do something differently. And then I went on with the Trauma Resource Institute. Another woman named Lori Leach, who was a social worker and a psychologist, joined us for a while, and she contributed greatly. So, I mean, when you create something, you don't do it in a vacuum or by yourself. I often say you stand on the shoulders of people that have come before you and people who are with you side by side to conceptualize ideas to help the broadest amount of people possible. So I think that for me, the inspiration was, how do you make things more accessible? I was always drawn to social work because I wanted to work with people who didn't have the access to the same kinds of services. So when I started learning about body-centered interventions, I said, wow, this is something so important for all of us to learn. And I think that's how both models started being developed. The community resiliency model that I've talked about on the show, we've had many people that are using it around the world. And that was the teaching of the natural leaders of communities. But then we wanted to create something that was for people in the mental health professions that they could use to also start reprocessing traumatic experiences. So that's kind of in the nutshell.
Well, okay. I mean, that's thank you. And I also think there's something else I want to ask you that goes with this, that's continued. It's talking about being a woman and how we birth children. How was Trim birthed? And how has a female and a feminist perspective influenced the creation of Trim?
Oh my gosh, that is such a good question. And I think that is really important because, I was doing some research the other day and I noticed that, there's a high percentages, like in the 70% percentile of people who become therapists are primarily women. And so, I was also noticing that on one particular conference series that I was asked to speak at, the majority of the presenters were male. Now, I know, oh my goodness, I have so many wonderful male colleagues and I've learned from the male perspective, and it certainly has been integrated into the work that I've done. But I do think that women bring something special into therapy. Of course, there's so many of us, but also in terms of creating models, because I think that with the trauma resiliency model, I have had a feminist perspective. And that feminist perspective, what does feminism mean? It means that we are looking at things through the eyes of being a woman. And certainly that colors the way that we look at relationships and the way that we look at nurturing our families and our relationship. There's been lots of research about the differences between male and female. And now we have this burgeoning area of people that don't identify as either. They're non-binary. And I think that's important. And I'm really looking forward to what kinds of modalities and ideas come forth from our friends and colleagues that identify as non-binary as well. But I think that this perspective has been very important because I think the trauma resiliency model is a gentle approach, and people have said that to me, and I think that gentleness comes from the nature of, I think, how I am and how many people that I know are. And that doesn't mean that people that are non-binary or male are not gentle, but I think that there's a gentleness approach that comes from my feminist perspective regarding this. And I really want to also let our viewers know that this is also being recorded live on Facebook. If you go to Resiliency Within, this is the first time that I'm going to be showing some slides as I talk about the trauma resiliency model, because I have a hunch, Jess, you're going to ask me about that next.
I am. And can I just say one little thing too, is that I think there's one important piece from your background
Okay.
that helped
You know me well.
influence, which helped influence Trim. And does that, I think it's important to share too about when you were a Lamaze teacher. That gentleness
Yes.
that you talk about is part of how you created this. So
It is.
tell
It
us
is.
more about that.
Well, okay, I will. I'll tell it now. So there's many foundations of what the trauma resiliency model is based upon. But when my son was born in 1979, I was so excited about giving birth. I had a very natural childbirth. It was painful as heck, but I had a way to move through the pain of it. And it was, I had skills, but I also had a really incredible partner and nurse that guided me gently to pay attention to to what else was true in the room besides the pain I was experiencing inside of my body. But there was also a well-being and resiliency in my body that I also paid attention to. And in fact, my husband and I were playing backgammon in between the contractions. My husband always talks about that story because that wasn't quite our vision of what birth might be like. But I think what happened with that is I became so impassioned about childbirth. And I really lobbied to become a Lamaze childbirth educator. And at that time, they didn't let non-nurses in. And I lobbied and they let me in, and I took all the same classes as the nurses did. And there was a couple of us that were non-nurses that were in our training program. It was held at UCSF in San Francisco, University of California. It was a lot like getting a master's degree. But from that, I also became a doula. And the doula is a person who attends to the childbearing family during childbirth. I mean, they also work with the family before and after the baby is born. But I learned that there could be a gentleness in how we talked, changing the tone of our voice, being present in a way that we held the pain with the person, but also held their well-being and reminded them that there was well-being amidst the very intense experience of birth. And there was an organicity in that. The experience of childbirth, and not everything. And I don't want people to think, oh, are you saying only natural childbirth? Of course not. Many people that I worked with had experiences of having a cesarean. My daughter Jessica had a cesarean, but it was about helping the person through the experience of birth. And outcomes sometimes were not planned, and there were very sad and tragic outcomes. But being present with that too, in terms of being a guide and holding the space for grief, was also an important part of that. So thank you, Jessica, for reminding me of that, because you probably have heard that story so many times about how that did imbue my spirit. Yes. So would you like me to go forward a little bit about the trauma resilience?
Yes. Yeah. What is TRIM? What is the trauma resiliency model? Tell us.
Okay, so I want
Who
to
is
say
this beautiful little girl too?
yes, I have to say that was me when I was. I have a picture that I have on the Facebook Live. The picture of me as a little girl in El Salvador with a traditional casa dress of El Salvador, and I put that in my. I want you to describe that to you, to our listeners, because I think our lived experience shapes us, sparks our creativity, is of the mind, body, and spirit. And so when I'm thinking about the trauma resiliency model, it always was also with the idea of what's helped navigate our life's journey. And many of us have had trauma, but we've also had other things that have happened to us. We've had experiences of well-being. And sometimes as a trauma therapist, I learned a lot of models that focused on the trauma. What is going on with you? Tell me the story. But it almost focused on the trauma to the degree of shrouding some of the natural elements of well-being that also existed amongst the storm of what happened to us. So I think that with the trauma resiliency model, that the wellness skills and incorporating that, just like we incorporated skills in childbirth education, became very important. So the trauma resiliency model has 9 skills. It can be used with kids, with teens, with adults, and also I've taken it across cultures. Even when someone can't read or write, they can learn skills, and we can help reprocess the event. And I think the thing that makes it a little different from other models is that the wellness skills of the trauma resiliency model can be used for self-care for the therapist. Because as we know, many of you may know, is that therapists also, they're hearing many stories. And so it's really important that they cultivate their well-being as well as helping the client. And so we also want to reprocess the traumatic experience. And people have said, what in the heck does that mean, reprocess? And from a body-centered approach, it means that what happens to us not only happens to our mind, it happens, we have emotional expressions, we have thinking about it, but our body has a whole reaction to what happened to us. And so what we have learned through body-centered approaches, and there are many people that have been in the leaders of the field like Peter Levine and Pat Ogden, is that we can reprocess them by working in the area of what we call implicit memory. That's body-centered memory that has a really precise memory of what has happened to us, even if we don't know cognitively what's happened to us. And this is important because, for example, let's say if we were bitten by a dog when we were 1 year old, we don't have what's called explicit memory, factual memory of being bitten by that dog. but our body has a memory. So maybe as an older child or as an adult, this happened to me with a friend, you see a dog and it can be a very small dog. And all of a sudden your whole nervous system starts, your heart rate starts to beat quickly. You feel your hands becoming sweaty, and you have a sense of fear. And here it's a little teeny dog. And why am I having this reaction? You don't know why, but your body knows why. So one of the exciting things about working with the trauma resiliency model is we do not have to know the story of what happened to you to work with the body's reactions to the things that have happened to you in your life. I've done whole sessions with people working with the most traumatic elements of their life with not knowing what happened to them, because they may not know, but there are also experiences that some people have where they don't want to tell me the story, even though I will always say to them, I can hold whatever you want to tell me. But for example, I can think of working with a veteran who said, Elaine, I can't tell you the story because I don't know if you would like me if you knew what happened to me and what I did there. And because there's such shame that can go along with trauma. But when I could talk with this person and say, well, if you want to ever tell me, you can tell me as little or as much as you'd like about the story, but I am here for you. And so sometimes it's only working with the body-centered aspect of it. And I think that's a very important element, because we may not know what happened to us, but yet we know something happened to us. So the goals of the trauma resiliency model is we give education, and we give education about the neuroscience and biology of traumatic experiences. We are called a trauma-informed intervention because that's that trauma reprocessing of going back to that event and trying to renegotiate or re-experience in the present moment what we would have wanted to do but couldn't. So for example, I was in a car accident. I'll give you an example. When I worked with a somatic therapist, and what I would have wanted to do, I would have wanted to turn the wheel. And so the car would have passed me rather than hit me from behind. Well, of course I was really hit, but the body didn't know it was over. And I had a lot of reactions of kind of being afraid to turn my head to the back, to look behind me. So when I was able to work with a somatic-based therapist who knew TRIM, I was able to actually do in the present moment what I wanted to do then but couldn't, which was turn the wheel. I just did it, in a kind of almost, it's not role playing, it's real playing. And then I had the experience of the car going past me, and my whole body shuddered and started shaking, but shaking to release it. We even have colloquialisms, right, in our language that's called shake it out. And that's what my body did. And I felt a complete healing of that experience, even though it actually had happened to me. So that's why we call it trauma informed. And also resiliency informed is so important. And I'm actually adding something to that: resiliency and compassion informed. And that's also, again, the education of the neuroscience of resiliency, but also is really trying to focus a bit on what is right with you, what are your strengths, and really having individuals really experience that within their body, so that we move in this direction of from conventional thinking to that, oh, maybe I'm just a bad person, to no, you suffered, something happened to you. And guess what? You can cultivate your self-compassion. And I do believe that healing is possible, because sometimes people don't believe in the possibility of that. And so I think there is a golden thread of compassion that comes through when we work with the body, because we might say, oh, I'm a compassionate person. You may be compassionate to everyone in the world, but to yourself. And how many of us have beaten ourselves up and said, oh no, I'm just a bad person, I can't do this. So and I think, Jessica, you've seen in your clients as well, haven't you, a similar sort of response? And what I'd like to do is, when we get back we're going to break in just a couple of minutes, is to maybe bring out one of the stories of where you see this profound change that happens. And what I also want to impart to those of you that are thinking about what we're talking about, if you change your nervous system, or if you have a therapist that knows about a body-centered approach, I think that we can change the way we walk in the world of having more self-compassion and compassion for others. And one of the people that I admire, and I know you're going to ask me that question, Jessica, but I admire Mother Teresa, because she said, if there wouldn't have been the one, there wouldn't have been the many. And to me, that has to do with that first person that she carried out of the gutter in Calcutta and took that person into the convent and ministered that person until they died. But after that, she ministered to so many people. So I think that I want to encourage all therapists to think about how they can become a body-centered therapist along with other models that they know and deliver. And for those of you that have had trauma, to really think about adding the body interventions to the kinds of help that you're getting. So, Jessica, is there anything that's on your mind right now, and another question in right before we take our break that you would like to say?
I think it's so important to include the body. That's the missing piece on so many treatment modalities that are out there right now. I've had people come to see me, and they feel like they get stuck, or they can't move forward, and after we do some body work and integrate the body and sensation into our work, it's life changing, and it's so important, and it's empowering too for the individual to sense into their body.
And isn't it
to see what it's capable of?
Yeah, that people didn't think it was possible for them to experience their body in a different way.
Yeah.
So Jessica and I will be talking more together, and she's going to tell us she's going to share with us some of her ideas also about working as a clinician with the trauma resiliency model when we come back from the break. But Jessica, thank you so much for being with me today. And we will have more of this discussion about the trauma resiliency model when we come back. And we will continue to discuss some of the elements of the foundations of the model that also may help you understand it a little bit better, and how this approach may be very empowering for those of you that have struggled with what I call mental health challenges. So we will be back in just a moment with more from Jesessica Karas and from me, which I would love to talk about the trauma resiliency model, I think, as you may notice, and we'll talk more about it.
All right, nicely done. Good segment. We're all clear. Back in a couple minutes.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Thanks, Jess.
You're welcome.
Well, I'm going to just move a little bit ahead because I want to come to this part about talking. When we come back from the break, we'll talk more about this. But we've talked about these doorways of therapeutic interventions already. But I also want to talk about a little bit about defining the terminology. So for our Facebook Live listeners, I think it's important that we give some vocabulary about how we talk about it as well.
I think that would be good. I think it's helpful to see the slides as well. So I like that we're telling people about the Facebook Live so they can see these.
Yeah,
so that important.
Yeah, so that people we'll remind our listeners too that they can go to the Resiliency Within Facebook if they want to see the slides that go along with the broadcast.
I mean, I could interview you for hours. I feel like there's so many questions I want to ask you that I feel are important questions. But this hour, it really flies by. It goes quick.
I know. It's like we've already gone through 30 minutes, and I've only given a little bit of what this is about, right? So for our Facebook Live listeners, there's much more, but we're hoping to give you a little bit of idea of what the model is about. And you can also go to the Trauma Resource Institute, who's the sponsor of our Resiliency Within program. And of course, they'll talk more about it, which is also a good thing to have happen. Yeah. Oops. There we go. So did I just stop the screen share by accident? I think I did. I did. Well, I'll just put it back on. There we go.
I think it's one of those things too on a Monday where I feel like not only are we waking up as people, but technology is also waking up on Monday. So you're brave to do your show every Monday at 1 Pacific time.
Thanks, Jess. Thank you. The other thing I think for our Facebook Live listeners as well, I think that we also have more information and ways to sign up to become a trauma resiliency model practitioner for those of you that are therapists. And for those of you that are not therapists, there is information about the community resiliency model. And the community resiliency model has the first 6 skills of the trauma resiliency model are the community resiliency model skills, so that you can go and learn a little bit more about those wellness skills that we have found have been really life changers for the clients that we work with as therapists.
All right, we'll be coming back in about 15 seconds.
Thank you, Matt.
Mhm.
That went by quick too. The break.
Yep.
You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
This is Resiliency Within with Elaine Miller-Karas. To reach the show during our live broadcast, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. That's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email to elaine@resiliencywithin.com. Now, back to this week's show.
Welcome back. This is Elaine Miller-Karas, and I am with Jesessica Karas Waterson, psychotherapist, who has been interviewing me today about the trauma resiliency model. But of course, I'm going to interview her a little bit right now because she has been I think you've been a TRIM practitioner for over 9 years, Jesessica. And so can you maybe give us a little bit of insight from your perspective? I know that you've shared before the break of how important working with the body is, but can you give us and maybe illuminate us a little bit more about why you as a therapist think this is so important? And maybe even with story or two. Yes.
Yeah, well, I think that, like I said before, there's people that have gone to traditional talk therapy their whole life or for years, and they feel like they get to a certain point and it doesn't progress any further, or like maybe something's missing. And I'm not bashing talk therapy because I do talk therapy as well. But what's so great about TRIM is that you can interweave it into what you're already doing. So if you do talk therapy, if you're doing cognitive behavioral therapy as a clinician, you can integrate TRIM into this. And what I've seen through when people come to see me is that at first, the language of sensation, right, that can feel really weird. It's a whole different way of speaking. To check in and actually, when we ask people, what are you noticing in your body right now? They might say, oh, I don't know. What do you mean? So if someone's saying, I feel sad, I would say, where do you notice that sadness in your body? Where does that sadness live? And they might tell me, in my stomach. And then we would work with that. I'd ask, is it unpleasant, pleasant, or neutral? And if it's unpleasant, we would work with that, because as we know, energy from traumatic events can become stuck in the body, in the nervous system. And so TRIM has really allowed me the framework and the tools and the skills to really help people not only understand the biology to trauma and how it affects their body, but also it helps me tease out that trauma from the nervous system, and it helps me help that person get back into their resilient zone or into a more regulated state. And it also, what's so great is the 6 skills, as you already said, is the community resiliency model. But you can teach your clients these first 6 skills, and they can leave after one session and have tools that they can use. And they come back up at the second session and say, I actually used that skill of grounding, and it really helped. It sounded so simple when you were explaining it to me, but I used it. And grounding is one of our skills in TRIM and CRIM, where you just pay attention to your body in the present moment, making contact with the surface. And there's so many different ways that you can ground. You can ground through lying down, you can ground through your hands, you can ground through sitting. And this is really just a time where you're not thinking about the future. You're not thinking about the past. You're thinking about your body and sensing into your body in the present moment. And that can be enough to override sensations or feelings of anxiety. And that's just one of the skills of the model. So I have seen people come in and their body has looked so tight when they first started seeing me. And the more we worked with helping them release that energy from their body that was stuck, you literally see their whole body just shift and loosen up.
So Jesessica, when you say, you help people, get unstuck, and you talked about grounding, can you talk a little bit about the 3 skills like pendulation and survival responses. How does that help the person? I mean, there's 9 skills altogether. Of course, we don't have time to tell you all in the hour show, but I think that when you just talked about how people sometimes come in and they're so contracted with tension, and some of those reprocessing skills are so helpful. Can you give an example of like the completing of survival responses, for example?
Yeah, of course. So the 3 reprocessing skills, we have titration, pendulation, and a completion of survival responses. And I've had lots of different examples that I can use, but if I had to use one, there was one female who came to see me, and she had a lot of childhood trauma from an overly intrusive mother. And a lot of our work was about her mother and how her mother was always there. Her mother was everything. It was just always a mess talking about her mother and how abusive the mother was with her words, and just how her mother was never there, never showed up. So I asked her, I said, as you're telling me about your mother right now, what are you noticing in your body? And she said, I feel so angry. I just feel so angry everywhere. And I said, well, okay. And where do you notice the anger? I notice it everywhere, but I just wanted to hit her in that moment. And I said, okay, is there anything that your body wants to do right now? Are there any movements? So I saw your arm just do that. And she was like, yes, I just want to do that. I just want to hit. I'm like, okay, I'm going to invite you just to make that movement of hitting your arm, and just let your body do what it needs to do. Let it move the way it needs to move. And she just was doing it. And initially,
So she was
it
just
was kind of
moving
hard.
her hand back and forth. Yes.
It was like an elbow hit.
An elbow. Okay.
Like an elbow. Like she wanted to just hit. And so I invited her to move her arm however it needed to move. And it just, eventually it was going fast at first, and then it just slowed down. And then you could just see the body slowly just kind of melt back down. And then there's this big, deep parasympathetic breath, which is connected to our rest and digest system of knowing that we're coming back into our resilient zone, which is what we teach in TRIM and CRIM, which is a more regulated state of well-being where you feel like you can manage what life throws at you. So then I said,
yes. Go ahead.
I said, just notice what's happening in your body now. And she took a deep breath. She said, I feel so much better. I've always just wanted to either push her away or just hit her, even though I would never hit her. I just feel so much better.
You know, I think what you're pointing out about the model is we're giving the body a platform, giving the body the space to finish maybe movements that they couldn't make at the time because they were too little. But it's not about, I want really to underscore for our listeners, it's not about that we're encouraging people to be violent towards someone. We're helping the body release something that got stuck on the inside by making movements that are really coming from parts of our brain that were about our survival, that were blocked, that couldn't get out. So what Jessica's really describing is those release sensations that help the body come back into equilibrium. But, you know, when you say something like that, Jessica, what was the offshoot? Like when she came back, like the next week, was there a change in your client? Did she notice that there was a change in her lived experience? Because I think this is also the gentleness of it, is that paying attention and the invitation to do what the body would like to do.
I would say that it's kind of like an onion. Sometimes when you peel back the onion, there's something else. There's another layer.
Yes.
And there's another layer. And there was lots of layers to this individual that I was working with. And I would say that she was a little less just mad because she was having trouble in her marriage, even because she was just getting angry at everything. And she said that she fought less with her partner that week. But then we also had more things to work through. And there was when I saw this particular client, there was a lot of completions that happened around this mother of hers.
So I think we want people to think it's going to be just one time, and that there, like you said, there's the peeling of the onion. And also this is something that's really important, because when we have stuck energy, you're saying it impacted her emotional expressions. So she was angry at her husband a lot. Sometimes that also gets conveyed to the workplace. So it's not benign that people get things, that this energy gets stuck in the body that needs to be released. And so we see those patterns change. And the thing that Jessica said that's so important, she invited her to notice the change. Because when you notice the change, that's part of what the model is built upon, is that that neuroscience theory about brain cells that are firing together or wiring together. So we're actually changing the implicit memory capsule, so to speak, of something that happened to her. Yes, it did happen to her, but she's changing in this present moment what her body wants to do. And that kind of brings me to the next aspect, Jessica, about the models based on biology versus mental weakness. Because people like your clients start thinking, oh, there's just something wrong with me. I'm always fired up, and so we have seen all over the world that there are common reactions to stressful and traumatic events that not only affect the mind and body, but also affect the spirit as well. And so there's kind of 6 domains of human existence: what we think, how we feel, what's happening in our body, our spirituality, the behaviors, like Jessica was saying about the anger towards the partner, and how that impacts relationships. And what we've seen when we've gone around the world is that people pretty much say the same thing about common reactions. And they haven't known a way out, like Jessica said, about that missing piece. And that's why we say the model's based on laws of nature, that there's natural rhythms that exist in our nervous system as well as exist outside in nature. There are different seasons, for example. But if we've had a lot of this trauma, like you said, Jessica, was in her stomach and she was so tight, that those sensations of discomfort and pain become patterned inside of our bodies. And we sometimes go to chiropractors, we go to massage therapists to get that out. And maybe it will be released for a while and we'll feel better. But even people that I know that are body workers, that are therapists, often will come to our trainings to learn what we do, because they know that there's an element that can also help their clients. So I think that's another important piece to this. And that, the elements of the trauma resiliency model, are also, we have cousins in other somatic therapies. And I wanted to call out Judith Herman's work. And she wrote a book that I read many years ago that I'm forgetting the name of it at this moment, but I'll make sure the listeners know. But her book, when I first read it, talked about survival responses. And she talked about women who had been victimized by sexual assault or intimate partner violence, and how important it was that it was also held in the body as well. And when we think about other elements of what the model is based upon, it's also neuroplasticity. Because if you feel trapped by what your experiences of what's inside of your body and what you think, those of you that have had a lot of trauma, it's really important to know that, the brain can change. There's a concept called neuroplasticity, and it means the brain can change. And to me, this is such hope. And there's also something called neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is the ability to create new neurons and connections between neurons throughout the lifetime. And that's also integrated into our knowledge of how we work with people. But I think one of the things that hit me the most, and Jessica, I think we both have seen this, is that we talk about the biological basis of threat and fear. So when Jessica, when you talked about this woman, she lived in an experience of threat and fear during her childhood. Then sadly, we're talking about Mother's Day, but we're also talking about mental health awareness, is that sometimes the people who cared for us also did not treat us in the best way. And so there's studies that have shown, and I wanted to highlight the Mind Your Heart study, that they studied 178 individuals who had full diagnosis of PTSD. And what they found was that people who had post-traumatic stress disorder scored significantly worse on processing speed, category fluency, verbal learning, and verbal recognition than those without PTSD. So what they concluded was that there was significant poor performance in several domains of cognitive function, particularly in tests involving processing speed and executive function. Executive function are decision making. And so if we're stuck in these trauma symptoms from and have post-traumatic stress, I like to call it injury, because I believe you can heal from it, know that there's something that happened to you biologically. And it doesn't mean you're mentally weak or you're pathological. It means something happened to you. And that with this foundational information that we integrate into TRIM, that you can have a different lived experience, because we focus on also the anatomy and physiology, the structures of body parts and relationships to one another, the physiology of the different hormones that are released in your system. For instance, cortisol that can get stuck. It's there for short acting, but if it gets stuck, then that can compromise our immune system. So we in TRIM observe and have knowledge of the patterns of the nervous system, and we help the clients, our clients, tell the difference between sensations of distress and well-being that I think our listeners have, if you've listened to other shows, have heard me say this before. But you mentioned it, Jessica, if that person has an elevated heart rate, they're feeling tense and tight all the time. How do we help them access their parasympathetic nervous system, where they take that deeper breath? And even though this system, this autonomic nervous system of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, it's called automatic because it happens without thinking, it doesn't mean that we can't evoke perhaps a parasympathetic response, excuse me, by the skills of the trauma resiliency model. So I kind of want to stop at this point, Jessica, and see the time is quickly slipping away. This is giving our listeners a little bit of an idea of what the model is based on. There's more to it as well in terms of gene. Well, let me just go a little bit further. There's sensory integration theory that I read the work of Dr. Jean Ayres. Excuse me. And she provides foundational knowledge about how the body receives information for nervous system stabilization. And she came out when Jessica talked about grounding, how gravitational security was really important for us to sense safety in the present moment. So some people that have had trauma always feel like they're floating. So if this has been your experience, sometimes just even putting a heavy pillow or blanket on your lap can make you feel more grounded to the present moment. And remember that you can go to our iChill app that has those skills of well-being. But there's also focusing, and Eugene Gendlin came up with the idea of the felt sense. And this is at the core of the trauma resiliency model. And that means that every thought and feeling and experience that we have also has a corresponding sensation in the body. So, for example, if we feel happiness, or if we feel love or anger, there's an action, there's an increase in sensation in our body. Now, if we ask that question, what was the question again, Jessica? Is it pleasant,
unpleasant, or neutral?
Neutral. Perhaps the anger would be unpleasant, but we don't know. We'd have to ask. But we want to help people understand that it's not only what we think and feel, but what we sense. And that's where interoceptive awareness becomes so important. This is being studied. It means our ability to observe body sensations in response to how we think, feel, and move. And when we become attuned to our sensations, like when we go outside and it's hot, we may know that we're not going to wear a big old warm winter coat. So we'll take off that. If it's warm, we will take that coat off, or we'll know not to bring even the coat outside. So that's a behavior, right? We know not to wear the coat if we're warm. What's telling us we're warm? Our sensory system. We have billions of sensors that are giving us information all the time. And what we want to do with intention is bring more attention to our well-being, because what researchers are finding is that body awareness can reduce impulsivity and promote emotion regulation and clear thinking. And that's another reason why, in a neuroscientific perspective, it's very important. The other aspect of TRIM is also solution-focused psychotherapy. I saw Insoo Kim Berg years ago. She's now passed, but she was the first one that I heard say that our clients know more about the solutions to their life than the therapist does. And that was kind of like revolutionary at the time, 30 years ago. Many therapists spend years out in classes learning interpretation of your experience. But what we have found is when we ask people, when they have that shift in the nervous system, and when, Jessica, when your client said to you, well, I'm not as angry, right? So Jessica didn't say, oh, you're not as angry, are you? That would be planting that with the therapist, with the client. We would say, oh, what would be the words that you would use to try to elicit that, Jessica? Like, would you
What
ask
do
her
you
about
mean?
meaning that the person
Oh,
has in the shift?
yeah. Whenever that you kind of discharge or move around a lot of energy in the body, usually there's meanings that might come forward or new insights. So we would just say, are there any new meanings or insights coming forward for you right now, or not?
And the
And
or
so
not,
the or not's important.
it is, isn't it? Because we don't want to assume that there are any new meanings. So it's really, and this is another reason why I think this is a very, client-centered approach. And I guess that's another, I think for me, that's my feminist perspective, not to presume that I know all the answers. That when Jessica was a little girl growing up, I would ask her, well, do you want to wear the red shirt or the blue shirt? Do you want to wear the shorts or the long pants? She always wanted to wear shorts because she was always hot. So whether it was cold outside or not, but that kind of solution focus becomes a very important part. So I'm going to pause there and let our listeners know that there's a lot more to share about the trauma resiliency model, but I think that gives you some of the key aspects of it. But I know that in the few moments we have a few minutes left that Jessie and I wanted to talk just a little bit, Jess. Do you want to say something, about being a mom right now to our guests? And I know that you've used elements of the wellness skills of the trauma resiliency model. So if you can say in a minute or more, like just some kind of parting information about why this is important for you as a mom, learning all
Yeah.
this information as a therapist.
It's I think important for every mom to know about the first 6 skills, of course, the to regulate their nervous systems, and to also track what's going on in your body as a parent, because throughout the day you could be feeling all different sorts of emotions. And I think also being a working mom, and I see all my clients from home, and then my daughter's here, and she might come in the room sometimes. I have to use the skills on myself to stay in my zone, because it can be a lot. It can definitely be a lot. And I think I just want to send my love to all the other mothers out there, and fathers, and grandparents, and anyone that has small kids in their home right now. It hasn't been easy. You could have the best kid in the world, and it's not easy. So using these wellness skills, I really want to encourage everybody to download, if you can, the app that can help guide you through these first 6 skills, and that hopefully they can be really helpful, so then you can start to track more what's going on in your body, so you can know when you need to bring in a skill or when you need to walk outside for some fresh air. And I think it's just been really helpful, and just knowing that we can have certain reactions, like you and we can get in a fight
We
one
can.
second, and we can, and it happens, and that's normal. And I think that we can understand that we may say things when we're in that fight that we don't mean, and that's because we are out of our resilience zone. And we don't have to hold as much shame for maybe the things we said, because we know we didn't mean them, but also we know that we say things we don't mean when we're out of our zone, and that's biological. That's just what happens when you go into a survival response or a survival mode. And I just want to say one more thing too, is that something that you taught me, Mom, that I passed down to my daughter, that, and it's so cute when I hear her say it, is that human beings, the beautiful and wonderful thing about being human is being imperfect, and that's what makes us human. And then I added one little part to that, because I love sci-fi, is I added, we don't want to be robots. How boring would that be if we were all robots, right? So that imperfection piece, because there aren't really imperfect robots, right? So that imperfection piece that makes us human is so important, I think, to teach our kids about. And that we're going to make mistakes, we're going to mess up, we're going to say things we don't mean, we're going to act in ways that maybe we regret, but that's part of the human experience. It's how do you come, and this is something else you taught me, how do you resolve that conflict, or how do you resolve that problem that happened after the fact? How do you come together and mend?
Well, you're
So
certainly making my day that you did remember some of those things that I taught you.
I did.
So
I
that's
did.
good. Well, and I guess I say we're perfectly imperfect. And so, and I also think that, as a family, that we talk the language of the wellness skills that we've been talking about throughout the show. And that is Jessica goes, well, Mom, you're way out of your zone. Oh my gosh, you're right. I'll do something to ground myself. I'll say the same thing back to her. Or maybe we'll say, well, maybe one of us needs to take the dogs for a walk. So I think that integrating wellness skills is really important. And so I'm just going to reiterate the thing about the iChill app. But I also want you to know that I'm so proud of my daughter, Jessica. And she is, as we said, a senior trainer for us at the Trauma Resource Institute. But she also has a private practice. So Jess, if people wanted to ask you questions too about TRIM, you have a web page. Would you like to share with us the web page right now?
Sure. It's Jessica Karas, LMFT.com. So Jessica and then Karas, LMFT.com.
Great. So you can get a hold of Jessica through her website. You know that you can get a hold of me through Resiliency Within, Elaine at resiliency.within.com. And I would like to thank our listeners for being with us. We'll have more shows on the trauma resiliency model, as we could see that this time went by really quickly. People are interested. Go to traumaresourceinstitute.com, our sponsor. And I just want to remind you all to pay attention to what else is true in your life as you go through your week until we meet again. And next week, I'll have a really inspiring guest, Clive Corey from Northern Ireland, who will talk about what inspired him as a result of the death of his wife. And he's one of the leaders in bringing healing to the world. So until we meet again, remember what else is true. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica, for coming and being with me.
You're
all
welcome.
Right, awesome job today. Good show. We're all clear.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Thank you always.
Thank you.
So we're still on Facebook. So we just want to just reiterate to all of our Facebook listeners how you can get in touch with the Trauma Resource Institute, and you can also get in touch with Jessica at jessicakaraslmft.com. Anything more, Jessie, you want to say?
Yeah, I should have said it on the show, but I know we didn't have enough time, is that I only talked about movements with survival responses. And lots of times there's words, things that people want to say,
yes,
and vocalizations that they didn't get to say. So I just want to add that piece too, that it's not just movements that get stuck. It can be words that we want to say. And that can be so amazing when you see people speak the words that they wanted to say that they didn't get to say, and what can come with that. So I just wanted to add that little piece because I forgot to talk about that.
Well, it's hard to talk about everything we know about the trauma resiliency model in probably was about 50 minutes. So we know that for our Facebook Live listeners that there's more to say, and we will have more information about this in future shows as well. And I think I'll just post some additional things too on Resiliency Within about the trauma resiliency model. I'm in the throes of doing some updating of the trauma resiliency model right now. There's some really exciting new neuroscience that's coming down the pike that we want to include in our offerings. And so there will be more to come. So all of you who've suffered from trauma, I just want to say, remember that there's help available, and you can always contact the Trauma Resource Institute to find a trauma resiliency model therapist. So thank you, Jessica, very much for coming on my show, my daughter. It's so great to be with you.
You're welcome.
All right.
Yes, maybe we'll do another one.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.